Hey, this is Moritz and welcome to a new episode of All About Aviation. Air travel in 2021 looks a lot different than air travel 10 years ago, not only because of COVID and the significant reduction in air travel demand, but also because airplanes have become a lot more fuel efficient and personal passenger preference is changing to direct flights versus connecting flights with layover. With increased fuel efficiency and a growing preference for direct flights, we are entering a new paradigm in aviation. But let's backtrack just 10 years. Back then, if you would ask somebody who was familiar with air travel on the difference between short and long-haul flights, they would most likely say that small planes fly short routes and large planes fly long routes. And that would have been correct. There are many reasons that this was an accurate statement back in 2010. Small planes carry less fuel, therefore they are limited in travel range. Large planes carry more fuel, so they can fly further. Also, long-distance trips take longer, so one single airline can typically operate such a long-distance flight less frequently than a short-distance flight. As such, they try to maximize seating capacity, which requires larger aircraft. And long-distance flights can require more than your typical two pilots, because pilots are only allowed to work so long without rest, so that a third or even fourth pilot might be on board to replace one of the pilots once that pilot reaches the maximum working hours and will typically go into the crew rest, kind of a cabin within the cabin of an airplane, which is secluded from the passenger cabin, which this cabin takes room of course and therefore requires a large aircraft. So essentially in 2010, long-distance flights were flown by larger aircraft, while short-distance flights were flown by smaller aircraft. Yes, this is a rather simplified explanation, but it is accurate enough for the purpose of this video. Now, back in 2021, what has changed? Over the past 3 years or so, us aviation enthusiasts have been observing a shift in this paradigm. All of a sudden, smaller aircraft also fly long-haul routes. Take the Boeing 737, a narrow-body aircraft designed for short to medium-range flights with a capacity of up to 180-something passengers. Or take the Airbus A320, a very similar aircraft designed for short to medium-range flights as well. These planes are used for transatlantic flights nowadays, which for decades were solely served with much larger aircraft like the Boeing 767, the Boeing 777, or the Airbus A330. By the way, these larger aircraft are also referred to as wide bodies, given the wider width of their cabin compared to narrow bodies, like the 737 or the A320 with, you guessed it, a more narrow cabin. So why is that? As I mentioned already, fuel efficiency from the latest generation of engines has extended the range of these narrow bodies enough to open up transatlantic routes. You can now fly Halifax to Manchester in a Boeing 737. Of course, airlines are not flying these routes with narrow bodies just because they can. They do so because of customer demand. I talked about a growing passenger preference of flying direct as opposed to choosing connecting flights. So instead of filling their large aircraft with hundreds of passengers and flying them to central destinations like Frankfurt, Paris, London, with connecting flights to their final destination, airlines might choose to fly a smaller group of passengers directly to their final destination. This is the core difference between a hub-and-spoke routing system and a point-to-point routing system, but more about that in a separate video. But how does that concern me at all, you might ask? Well, there are differences in flying long range on a narrow body versus on a wide body aircraft. And it is simple things like being able to get up and walk around the cabin. In a narrow body, there is just less space for you to walk or to stretch your legs. Narrow bodies only have one aisle, wide bodies typically have two. Narrow bodies naturally feel less spacious than wide body airplanes, which can play a crucial role in passenger comfort. But it's not all bad. With less passengers on board, you might get through customs or immigrations a lot faster than if you arrive with 400 other passengers who have to go through the same checkpoint as you. Yeah, sure, again, a simplified perspective, but I can tell you from personal experience that arriving in New York JFK from Europe on a Boeing 747 with 300 plus passengers on board is not a lot of fun. The arrival hall is packed with people, checkpoints are limited, and as such I'd rather arrive with fewer passengers at the same time, hoping to save time in transit. So you can see there is pros and cons of flying long haul with narrow bodies. It is still too early to know how range capabilities of narrow bodies and passenger preference will change long haul flying, but it is definitely something you should consider when booking your next transatlantic flight, or pretty much any flight above 5 hours. I hope you had fun watching this episode of All About Aviation, and if you did, please give this video a like and comment below. All for now, speak soon.